Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to today's Maniac Talk. To start off, I wanted to go back to my usual thing, tell you a short story, and to get us going. This is Adventures of Monkey Rukia. Monkey Rukia is a monkey, of course, and she is heading home with 9 babies. On their way home, they find a tall tree, a nut tree with a beautiful, ripe fruits up there. And then the baby says, "You know what? We got to take these fruits. We can go home that way." They start climbing the tree. They can't make it. They beg the mother to allow them to climb the tree. They beg the mother to climb the tree and get the fruits for them, or the nuts for them. And then the mother hesitates a little bit, but she says, "Well, let me do it. You've been good babies today." She climbs all the way to the top. It's a 40-meter tall tree. It's pretty tall. And when she's there, she picks the fruit or a nut, and then send it down to the babies, and they're all happy eating. And then accidentally, she trips on one leaf, which falls down, and fall on these babies. And then they start screaming, complaining, and all that. So the mother is concerned, calms down, and says, "I'm so sorry for what happened, but I wish also, when I was picking the fruits for you, you were also saying thank you." None of you said thank you. Okay. So the moral of the story is that always remember to say thank you to those who are providing to you. Not only when they do something nasty that you can go complaining about it. So today we are fortunate. We have somebody from NASA headquarters. Of course, NASA headquarters is where we go when we need money. So sometimes it's not a bad idea to say thank you. Not only when you have a problem. So Richard Eckman has been with NASA since 1988, and he has actually been operating between NASA Langley and NASA headquarters. And of course, in his day-to-day duty, he's managing one of the most important programs at NASA headquarters, atmospheric composition, modeling, and analysis. And today, he's going to tell us about his journey. So please help me welcome our speaker, Richard Eckman.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles. No, it's a real honor to be here. Something I never imagined, and I suppose a lot of us are in the situation where chance encounters and unexpected events change where you think you're going to go and have a huge impact on your life and in your career. And I hope to spend a little bit of time here talking about my journey. I've looked through some of the other presentations that have been made under the Maniac series, and I'm a little bit of awe in the company that I'm in. People like Paul Newman and Jack Kay, my boss at headquarters, Eugenie Calnay, who talked about stumbling through her career. I'm sure she was being very modest. For me, in the abstract I provided, I said something like that I felt as if I might have been destined to work at NASA Langley, and I don't really believe in that sort of thing, but this is a picture of me, the little guy on the right, and my older brother in what I think is the summer of 1966. It might have been 65. And dates are a little hard on this since I scanned the picture in years ago and I don't have the original with me. Some background. I grew up in the Philadelphia area, and my father, during the 1960s, worked at the General Electric Missile and Space Division in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, which I think later became Northrop Grumman, and UR's had some connection with that facility in Valley Forge. My dad wasn't a scientist. He was a manager, but he was always interested in science, and really, I think was really directly responsible for both my brother and me getting interested in science over the years. And so we did these summer car trips. Sounds horrible. But they always had a theme. And for example, in 1967, we went to Expo 67 in Montreal, which was kind of amazing. And so I think this was the year before. I would have been probably 8 years old, possibly 7. And this is standing in front of the main gate at NASA Langley. And we were passing through Hampton. And back in those days, I imagine most NASA centers, it was a lot easier to get on site. The visitor center was on site. Anyone pretty much could drive through. In fact, at NASA Langley, up until around the time of the first Gulf War, pretty much anyone could just drive on site. And it was a pretty common sight in summers to see cars with Quebec license plates wandering around center completely lost, trying to figure out how to get to the visitor center, how to get out. But anyway, we were there, and one of the things that really sticks in my mind from that trip is we drove by the hangar at Langley, and it was open, the doors were open, and the lunar landing simulator was sitting there, a very spidery-looking thing that looked somewhat like the real lunar module. And I just remember being blown away by that, just finding that really fascinating. And so, who would have thought that 22 or 23 years later I would have come back to NASA Langley as a civil servant? And I'll spend the next few minutes talking about that journey. So, let's see. So my dad was always bringing home cool stuff from work, and a lot of it was NASA related. I dug this out of a Rubbermaid bin over the weekend. I remembered I had it. It's the Apollo 11 press kit for the lunar landing mission, of course. Some scribblings from my father at the top. But we just were always getting these sorts of things, little models. I remember one of, sounds kind of silly, but the radioisotope generator aboard the lunar module, I think it was called the SNAP 27 or something like that. We had this little model that he brought home, and I was fascinated with it and did a report at school on it, and I was the ultimate nerd, I suppose. So my father was a member of the Franklin Institute, a big science museum in Philadelphia, and they had I guess monthly lectures in the evenings for families, kids and parents. And the guy who usually gave those talks, I'll probably mangle his first name, something like Athelstan Spilhouse, a researcher who I think may have been the president of the Franklin Institute back in the 60s. His son is Fred Spilhouse, who was very active in AGU leadership for many years until a few years ago. So some of those lectures really stood out. I remembered one on the electromagnetic spectrum sometime probably around 67, 68, and just being really blown away by this concept of radio waves and visible light and how they were related. And so science was something that I got interested in early. The Franklin Institute also had a functioning weather station, and they had a group there called the Future Meteorologists of America. That really nerdy. But they had, I guess, monthly meetings on Saturdays, and they had several groups depending on age. And so I joined one of those groups, and I would go every few Saturdays, and we'd learn. I was 10 or 11 years old, so, only so much you can do. But, we learned how to plot weather maps from the teletype data. We learned how to interpret the data off of the teletype, the 3-letter codes for the airports, Teterboro and Newark and what have you. And so I became fascinated with meteorology, and I was convinced that was going to be my career. I think I was always fascinated by lightning, and so pretty early on, I read Weatherwise a lot, and or tried to read it, and I became an associate member of AMS pretty early on. This is from 1970. So I was like 12 years old, and I guess that was, I don't know, kind of unusual. I wish I had maintained my membership all these years. I'd be hovering up to 50 years now, but regrettably I let my membership lapse when I was in college. I'll get to that a little later as my career goals changed and I moved a little bit away from meteorology, but I didn't rejoin AMS until probably about 10 or 12 years ago. I was this little nerdy science guy, very interested in meteorology, and went to the University of Pennsylvania for undergraduate, majored in physics, also double majored in astronomy, but took a little bit of detour from meteorology at the time. It's one of those weird little events. I was reading somewhere that you could get aviation weather forecasts on long-wave radio, long-wave being the band just below the American AM broadcast band, around 200, 300 kilohertz. And my dad bought me a multi-band receiver. This was probably around 72 or so. And so I was able to get the, those weather broadcasts, and you'd get the various aviation weather sort of transcribed from the teletype and forecasts and so forth. But the radio also had shortwave bands, and so I discovered shortwave radio and became fascinated with ionospheric radio propagation, the idea of how the radio waves bounce off the E and F layers, and also became really fascinated with solar terrestrial relations and was always looking at the A index and geomagnetic activity and 10.7 centimeter flux, and so I gradually sort of moved away from meteorology towards ionospheric physics as a focus area. So fast forwarding a few more years, I finished up at the University of Pennsylvania in 1980, and I was convinced that I wanted to do graduate work in ionospheric physics. So one of the meccas seemed to be the University of Colorado at Boulder. I applied there as well as to a few other schools, got in at Colorado, and went there in the autumn of '80. And so I was a teaching assistant the first year, and ended up teaching or helping out for an undergraduate meteorology class taught by Julius London, and doing things like plotting weather maps and things like that. And that was an interesting relation back to my earlier interest in meteorology. But one of the things that I always wanted to do, I was familiar with a scientist who was then working at the NOAA Space Environment Lab named Ken Davies, who wrote a well-regarded monograph in the 60s on ionospheric radio propagation. So I met him not long after I got to Colorado, and we talked, and he was interested in me, working with him. And I, after my first year as a TA, I got a research assistantship from him for a semester, and was working at the Space Environment Lab doing some interesting stuff on gravity waves with ionospheric radars. But there was a problem with funding in those days with NOAA. It was the early time of the Reagan administration. NOAA funding was in peril. It seems like a constant story. I guess it's never improved. But sometime in '81, Ken sat down with me and said, look, I'm really worried that I can't fund you for the long haul. And we talked a little bit about some alternatives to ionospheric physics. And he had a few thoughts and introduced me to a few people. One of them was Tom Van Zandt, who was also at NOAA doing atmospheric dynamics, working with Ken Gage, and I sat down and talked with them, and he gave me a sheaf of his publications. I was also introduced to Charles Barth, the director of the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics, And they were in the midst of finishing the construction of the Solar Mesospheric Explorer satellite, which was built at Ball Aerospace in Boulder and would be, I believe, the first NASA mission controlled from a university. And it just really seemed incredibly exciting. And so, you know, a little bit lower in the atmosphere than I was originally thinking about. It was mesosphere, you know, upper stratosphere, but, and, you know, I never thought about doing ozone chemistry, but Dr. Barth introduced me to Dave Rush, one of his research associates, and just taking a quick detour, I just should say that Colorado was and continues to be a pretty amazing place for atmospheric physics. The department, as it was known at the time, was called the Astrogeophysics Department, and it really had a unique philosophy of combining fluid dynamics and plasma physics and radiative transfer in ways that you could have a lot of different disciplines within the department. So you had astrophysicists, solar physicists, people like Jim Klimchuk, who was several years ahead of me at the department. Chris McKay was there, just finishing up his PhD when I was starting. He's, of course, now doing astrobiology at Ames. And so it was a really exciting department where you could take a lot of different courses and apply them in a lot of different ways. And somewhat to my regret, it's kind of become more specialized over the years. There's now a specific atmospheric sciences department, and the relationship between those various disciplines of plasmas and astrophysics is kind of broken away, but still it was a great place to be in the early 80s. And so I started working with the Solar Mesospheric Explorer satellite. This is an embarrassing picture that my wife looked at this the other day and said, boy, those shorts are a little short. And so this is 1981. The Solar Mesospheric Explorer had been finished. Must have been around the summer, given my clothes. And I had even been at Ball probably a few weeks early in a clean suit in a clean room working with Roger Jacobek on some final calibration work. And I was scared to death to be in the room for fear of falling into the satellite or something, and I tried to stay as far away as possible so that I didn't hurt anything. But it was a cool experience. And then they were taking photos at the 55th Street last facility, I guess before it was packed up and shipped to Vandenberg. But I'm a little surprised that they were letting us just stand there in our street clothes that near for these photo opportunities. But there we were. It was launched in November of 81, and it was pretty darn successful. And so during that year, I was involved with doing retrieval algorithm work, of all things. One of my colleague graduate students was a guy named Joe Zawodny, who also ended up at NASA Langley, who I continue to work with, close to 30 years later, more than 30 years later. But the SME science team had a lot of great people on it, and I fell in with people like Gary Thomas, a really excellent radiative transfer person, Julius London, who was in ozone chemistry probably from at least the 50s, maybe earlier. And Susan Solomon was a member of the science team and was good friends with Dave Rush. And I was very fortunate to befriend her. She was very interested in my work, working with the UV spectrometer on SME. And so she got me into modeling. And this is from a couple years. Well, this is Fortran. It's not IDL. I thought I had an IDL box code, but this was an early code that I was writing September of 80. So this would have actually been for my first AGU in December of 83. I was doing some interesting work with taking the observed mesospheric ozone and kind of running it backwards to infer what you would expect the mesospheric water vapor to be based on pretty simple photochemical theory. And I remember Susan had gotten me in touch with Rich Bevilacqua, who was a graduate student at Penn State at the time, working with John Olivero, and I still have some handwritten letters. I save everything in my files from Rich, where we were exchanging data and thoughts. And so I got into modeling that way, and but I guess also my ongoing interest in solar terrestrial relations, which came from that sort of radio work, shortwave radio and ionospheric radio work that I was very interested in for many years, got me to thinking about how I could combine the two. You may know that there was a solar spectrometer on SME that Gary Rotman was the PI for, an early predecessor of Solstice. And that was working very well. We were getting spectrally resolved radiance daily from around, Lyman alpha out to 300 something, I imagine, nanometers, maybe beyond. And so, I'm not sure exactly where the thought came from, but what I've got on the left, I should also mention that talking all throughout this time with Julie London, and he got me very interested in the history of solar terrestrial relations, the history of ozone, and it was really neat to go back to the early journals, Schoenbein's work in the mid-1800s on discovery of ozone, the early spectroscopic work, Dr. and Mrs. Huggins and Hartley, and then, of course, Sidney Chapman and his work in the late 20s. And I continue to be totally boggled by how, given what was known at the time, that he essentially came up with the core of the correct theory of the allotropes of oxygen and how ozone was created and destroyed. And so another paper that I came across was this one by Humphreys in 1910 on solar activity and temperatures. It's a long and interesting field, a lot of junk science, but also a lot of very good science over the years. And at some point I was talking to Susan, and it may have been her idea, I'm not sure. This is actually her handwriting when we were thinking about how to turn my work into a thesis, probably in the 83 time frame, I suppose. And I only have the top of the page here because I never quite got to her thoughts at the bottom of the page. It would have been a much better thesis had I done it. But anyway, that was sort of the genesis of the idea that the solar spectrometer on SME could see the rotational period, the 27-day variability in ozone. I could see interesting short period variations in ozone from the UV spectrometer in the upper stratosphere and mesosphere. And, other people were doing this work. And in fact, I think I might have given my first talk on this at the AGU in December of '84. Don Heath came up to me and introduced himself, and we had lunch. And John Gilley, who was also on the SME science team, was doing some similar work with LIMS at the time. He scooped me on it with a GRL article in, I think, late '84. My thesis was done in '85. So let me move forward. So I just had this great thesis committee with Dr. Barth and the others. Julie London was actually on sabbatical for the last year of my work. I think he was at Zurich during that time. So I also needed an external examiner, and one that was recommended to me was John Burks, who I guess was at the aeronomy lab at the time, a kineticist. He worked with Paul Crutzen, did some interesting work on nuclear winter in the late 70s, early 80s. And again, as I was saying earlier, Boulder just was teeming, and of course continues to teem with atmospheric scientists. There are a lot of people who I could ping ideas off of, people at LASP, like George Mount, Ron Thomas, Ryan Sanders, regrettably, and Todd Clancy. John Gilly was there. I interacted a little bit with Ralph Cicero and Judith Lean. Susan had put me in touch with Roland Madden and Paul Julian, who were, of course, experts in spectral analysis. And I remember, sitting down a number of times with Madden, talking about how I was analyzing my data and getting his critiques on the ideas, and that was great. And then there was a constant stream of really neat people coming through LASP. For those of you who've been in the field a long time, you'll recognize Marcel Nicolet. He spent about 3 months at LASP, and I talked to him a lot about photodissociation rates and his ideas on these intricate parameterizations that he was famous for. Mark Allen from Caltech was a frequent visitor. He did a lot of earth science in those days before he went on to planetary science, and so it was always fun to talk with him about sort of the latest of my modeling work. And just sort of real quickly, actually to put a tiny bit of science into the talk, this is a time series of the SME Lyman alpha solar radiance normalized to 1 AU from Gary Rotman's solar spectrometer. I was trying to look at its influence on ozone, but recognizing also that it was a little more complicated than that. There was a radiative chemical interaction, which was kind of interesting and interesting to model with my very simple 1D model. This is just a few examples of some of the multi-month data that I analyzed, showing the 205 nanometer SME solar irradiance with a really nice, well-defined 27-day variability, the ozone mixing ratio at 0.85 millibars at the same time period in mid-82. And so I did a lot of analysis like that and finished my thesis, and so onwards. I always had a desire to do something interesting for a postdoc out of the ordinary. I had never been to Europe at the time, and I was fascinated by Europe. I loved French cinema, and so I thought I wanted to go to France. One of the people who came through Boulder, probably in '84, was Marie-Lie Chenin from the Service d'Astronomie and Verrières, who was doing a lot of interesting LIDAR work, looking at the thermal structure and gravity waves and the mesosphere and thermosphere. And we talked a little bit. And she was interested in the idea of me coming for a postdoc, but never really could get the funding sorted out, and never quite worked out. But another group that came by in '84 was John Harries from the Rutherford Appleton Lab, who was the director at the time, and he came along with John Pyle, who was still at the Rutherford Lab, and Rod Jones, who I think must have been at the Met Office at the time. And I remember several graduate students sat down with them and talked about our research. And I can't quite recall the exact circumstances, but I contacted John Pyle and asked him if he was interested in a postdoc. And the timing was really fortuitous, because he had just left Rutherford for Cambridge University. This would have been sometime in '85. And so he was interested, and we talked a little bit by phone. I submitted a formal letter, and lo and behold, he did have to run it through a formal selection process, because I wasn't coming from the European Community or the British Commonwealth. So I remember he advertised the position in New Scientist, and there were a host of people who applied. But thankfully, I made the cut and went in early '86 to Cambridge. and worked for 2 years in John Pyle's group. I was his first postdoc, and it was a really great time. Here's another fun photo. This is actually from just before I left Cambridge. This probably would have been January of '88, although it must have been a pretty mild day. From the roof of the physical chemistry department. So it was a really unique environment. When I first got there, John introduced me to the department chair, a guy named Brian Thrush, and I walked into his office and he was standing there talking with Joe Farman about ozone chemistry, and introduced to both of them, and you know, really lots of amazing people. Michael McIntyre was down the street at DAMP doing whatever Michael does and still does, and so this was a pretty cool group. You probably recognize a few of the people here. David Larry standing here in the top row, who spent a few years here, I believe, before going to Texas. Ralph Toomey, who went on to Imperial College. Stephen Beagley, who's at Toronto in the atmospheric group there. Martin Chipperfield, who was John's first graduate student, who's now a really outstanding modeler at Leeds. Glenn Carver, who I think is he may be at the Met Office now, but he was at Cambridge for many years. And Kathy Law is now at CNRS in France, but doing a lot of really great work. So it was a great team, a great time. Just eye-opening for me. I'd never been to Europe before, and I guess you could argue England's part of Europe, although maybe not for long, but it was an amazing experience. One of those chance encounters I had, you may be aware that I was an employee of the physical chemistry department of Cambridge, so I was a university employee, but I wasn't a member of any of the Cambridge colleges. So I was, and that was a little disappointing. And postdocs tended to have that problem, that they weren't necessarily members of college. They were too young to be fellows, too old to be students. So we were kind of in a gray area. But I knew a number of people at Emmanuel College. In fact, a number of Brian Thrush's students and postdocs. Brian was the department chair, but he was also the master of Emmanuel College. And there was one of those dinners where we were all sitting below the high table where the fellows sat. And one day a month or something like that, the fellows came down and sat with the students. And so one day Brian was sitting there with us, and I sort of spouted out that, it's a pity that I'm a postdoc and not really connected to any college. And so about 2 or 3 days later, there was a note in my mailbox with a formal invitation to join Emmanuel College as what they called a graduate member. That was sort of a made-up title. They didn't quite know what to do with postdocs. So I jumped at the chance and became a member of Emmanuel and met a lot of long-lasting friends that way. Weirdly, as I have in recent years funded Maggie Hurwitz, who works with Paul Newman here. I don't think she can make it today. She was telling me she probably wouldn't be here, but you probably know that she was a student of John Pyle's, and also coincidentally was at Emmanuel College when she was at Cambridge quite a number of years later. So, hopefully you're still awake. So I probably kind of peaked, I think. I guess people tend to peak in their science in their 20s, I don't know. But I had John and I were doing a lot of 2D assessment runs, various ozone runs in support of the UK's position on ozone reduction from the Montreal Protocol, which was signed in September of '87. So in the prelude to that, I was partially funded by the UK Department of Environment, and so I was doing a lot of assessment runs for that. I was also interested in, for some reason I became really interested in the nuclear winter studies that Crutzen and Birx had done in the late 70s. And I guess I should mention at this point that there were always American scientists coming through Cambridge. I guess, it was a fun place to go. There were really good scientists there. So there seemed to be a constant stream of really great people coming through. Ralph Cicerone came by once and sat down with John and me. Don Wubbles, who at the time was at Lawrence Livermore, came by, and we kind of struck up a friendship. He was very interested in my plans after Cambridge. And back in the day, Livermore had a really good modeling team, a very strong team, with Joyce Penner was still there, Doug Kinnison, who went on to NCAR, Doug Rotman and others. And so Don flew me out to Livermore in the summer of '87, and I gave an interview and talked with everyone, and I was very excited about Livermore. And my brother lives in Northern California, north of San Francisco, and I thought it would be nice to be kind of near him. So I thought, this is great. Livermore sounds like the place I'm going to go. But another guy who came out in '87 was Bill Gross, an atmospheric modeler at Langley. And we also talked a little bit, and he realized quickly I was an American citizen. He asked me what I was going to do with myself after my postdoc, and he also invited me to come out to Langley in the autumn of '87, give a talk and meet the folks at Langley, and I said sure. So I guess it was around that time, October of '87, that I published with John and Joanna Haig a paper in Nature with our 2D model calculations. We had put in some new reaction rates from one of the JPL compilations, I guess the latest one, and found some intriguing results in the lower stratosphere that involved odd hydrogen chemistry that kind of threw us for a loop, and we were surprised. And so we got a paper out of it. I think it helped that John knew the editors at Nature, and I know how hard it is to publish in Nature. So after some struggle, we did get it in, and I got it published. And so anyway, where I'm going with this is I was on my way to Langley in November of '87, and a few days before I left England, next slide. This guy here, Bob Watson, who probably many of you know, and a plane. This was an encounter on a plane. And this really changed my life in a weird way, and I suspect he doesn't know how important this conversation was. I saw him on BBC TV one evening. He was being interviewed about ozone and the Montreal Protocol. And I'd never met him before. I didn't even know what he looked like. I had seen his name on the JPL Chemical Kinetics compilation. So I knew who he was. But, so I saw him on TV, thought, well, pretty interesting looking guy with this East London accent, but he works for NASA. And so I'm on my flight a couple days later at Heathrow. I had just boarded and sat down, and he walks by. And, whoa, that's Bob Watson. And, things were a little more relaxed on airplanes back in those days, and we were flying to Washington on Pan Am. And so I got up and walked back and found him. He was traveling with, I guess, his girlfriend, Liz Gormley, who I guess was with the Chemical Manufacturers Association at the time. And I introduced myself to him, and he said, "Oh, you're that guy with that Nature paper, aren't you?" And so it was actually fortunate. He knew who I was, and so we talked for a while. And I actually mentioned to him, well, look, I was interviewed at Livermore a few months ago, and I was really excited about that. And but I'm going out to Langley and going to give an interview there. But I was probably telling him that, hey, I grew up in Philadelphia, and I thought, Hampton just seemed too far south for me. I just didn't think I could live that far south in the U.S. And, I remember him telling me, look, get over it. Langley is a really great place. Russell and McCormick, Jim Russell and Pat McCormick were there. Sage, Sam, the Halo mission was in preparation. So lots of really great observational assets were at Langley, and he was not in any way disparaging Don Wubbles or his team, but he said, you would love being at Langley. And I really think that straight talk to me really sort of turned me around and got me to really think of Langley as, and so I was there the day later and gave my talk and spent several days there talking with everyone, and a lot of curious characters like Jerry Keating and Lynn Callis and many others, and Joel Levine, and met Pat McCormick and his team, and Joe Zawodny, who was my graduate student friend, was there. He was a contractor at the time. So I was offered a position, and I took it. And I've been at Langley ever since early '88. I never imagined that I would be at one center for my or one agency for my entire career. And so Bill had a very interesting 3D model, which he had, its origins came from Reading University, Brian Hoskins, and work that Bill had done with Brian back in the 80s. And I think we made some reasonable progress with that. Could have done better, I think. I could have done better. But I had a very productive career, I thought, through the 90s, a lot of fun, but I found myself by the end of the 90s not having as much fun with atmospheric modeling. So the great thing about NASA is you could try different things, and so I got into branch management and became an assistant branch head for many years of its chemistry and dynamics branch. Bill Gross was the first branch head I worked under, and I outlasted a whole array of others. I'm not sure if they got sick of working with me or not, but Malcolm Coe, who joined Langley from AER back in the early 2000s, Dave Young, who went on to become the director of the science directorate at Langley, Gary Gibson, and I found that rewarding for a few years, but I also found that I had a hard time dealing with human problems, so to speak. When things became ugly in a non-science way, and I didn't find that rewarding at all. And so I realized that becoming a branch head wasn't quite what I felt like I was destined for. And so in '04, Lee Levan, who was then the director of the science directorate at Langley, asked me if I was interested in a short detail at headquarters in the Applied Sciences program. And, I had heard of applied sciences and applications, and I knew about some of the air quality work and aviation weather. I wasn't really sure about it. I wasn't quite sure if applications was just sort of a window dressing for the research being done at NASA. But I said yes, and it turned out that I ended up with the alternative energy portfolio, something I had no background with, and felt pretty much out of my element. And this kind of characterizes how I felt initially. And, for those of you who are familiar with Seinfeld, there was an episode where Kramer showed up at, I think it was a law office or an advertising office, and he just walked in and started working there. No one hired him. He just kind of was there and started doing his thing and didn't do a very good job. And at the end of the episode, his boss came in and said, "This is really hard for me, but I've got to let you go, but you don't even work for me." But thankfully, I didn't suffer that fate, but I really felt that way initially, walking into NASA headquarters, not really knowing anything about program management, and also not knowing very much about alternative energy other than as kind of an enthusiast. And but I really became fascinated with it. At the time, Ron Burke was running the Applied Sciences program, an interesting guy, who I really found extremely helpful in guiding my career, and others at the time who really helped me out. Steve Ambrose, who's now back at Goddard, I guess he retired a few years ago, really helped me wade through program management. And also, at the time, Ron was very interested in linking in with all of these other interagency and international initiatives. And the acronyms meant nothing to me at the time: CCSP, CCTP, GEO, CEOS, and I didn't know how they all interrelated or what they were all supposed to do. And I quickly learned, and to the point where the following year I was helping out coordinating one of the chapters for the CCTP strategic plan on measurements and monitoring. So I was there off and on really for a number of years, from 05 to around 08. Around that time, Jack Kay asked me, probably back in 07, if I was interested in doing a little work with the climate change science program. Bob Curran was there. He had retired from headquarters and was busy putting together all of these hour-changing planet reports and coordinating the atmospheric composition interagency working group that was run by Ravi Shankara at NOAA and Darrell Winter at EPA. And I thought it would be neat to kind of get back to atmospheric composition, so I agreed to help out there. And I never really knew Bob Curran very well, and I really enjoyed working with him for about the year and a half that I was there. I had a cubicle at the coordination office at 17th and Pennsylvania, and that was a great deal of fun. And then getting closer to the present and winding things down, as you're probably aware, David Considine, who was here as a contractor for many years, I knew him as a modeler with all of the atmospheric effects of aviation program work that we were involved with in the 90s. And David went to Langley as a civil servant, but then went up to headquarters to manage ACMAP. And after Don Anderson's departure from NASA, David took over the MAP program, and ACMAP had an opening, and Jack, I suppose it was probably through Lee Levan, asked if I was interested in a very short-term detail there to sort of handle the transition between David, who I guess was working very closely with Ernie at the time, and until they found someone a little more permanent. And I did that with some trepidation because I hadn't been really hands-on in the atmospheric composition world for a number of years, but I did it, and after close to 7 years still there as probably the longest detailee at headquarters managing ACMAP, and I still having fun doing it, and hopefully still doing a pretty reasonable job. And I hope that the people I fund, many of whom I see in the audience here, might think similarly. I've had a lot of interesting experiences in recent years with the interagency and international world, getting involved with the Committee on Earth Observation Satellites following Ernie's second retirement, and taking over from him with the incredibly productive atmospheric composition interagency, the constellation work that Rich McPeters and many others here have been very involved with PK and others for many years, and I found that very rewarding. And continue to work very closely with the now renamed U.S. Global Change Research Program, where I'm currently heading up a team that's putting together the update to its strategic plan. But a couple other things that I'm particularly excited about. One, Jack made me the program scientist for Stage 3 on ISS, which is due, I think, still to launch in February of next year. Obviously, the CRS-7 failure a couple days ago has put things in a little bit of doubt with the Falcon 9, but hopefully we'll see that launch early next year. But the other one was a couple years ago, Jack came to me and said, would you want to be the program scientist for Discover? And Hal Maring had been the headquarters program scientist for a number of years, but was really getting wrapped up with a lot of other activities at headquarters. And Jack assured me it would be easy. You know, it's really principally a NOAA mission, and we're probably not going to do a whole lot with it, and we don't have a budget. And so I said, sure. But it's taken on a life of its own. Many of you probably know far more than I do about its history, and Triana and Jay is in the audience here and has been involved with it for decades. But it launched in February, and all through last autumn, I was answering questions from the Office of Science and Technology Policy about Discover, and it turned out that our former Vice President Gore was still very interested in the mission. And finally, OSTP put me in touch with his staff, and we held a telecon with them back in December of last year, and I sort of made a comment to his policy advisor saying, hey, if you guys are at the Cape for the launch, we'd be happy to give you a briefing, and never thought about it again. And then the week before the launch, his policy guy, Brad Hall, got back with me and said, hey, would you give us a briefing? And this is, I talked to Mike Freilich about it. He was a little surprised, and had to talk to NOAA and OSTP and make sure it was all okay to sit down with Mr. Gore and do this. And so I quickly enlisted Jay and Adam Szabo, the project scientist, and Steve Clark, who at the time was the director of JASD, the Joint Agency Science Directorate. He's now the new director of heliophysics at headquarters. And so we very quickly, in the course of a couple days, put this briefing together. And the people down at the Cape were incredibly accommodating. I had my own parking space. I was feeling really important at the time. There's the Kennedy shuttle bus, but I could drive up to the launch building. And we had a great time, actually. Here's just one picture that wasn't horrible of Mr. Gore. And Dr. Grunsfeld, and lots of people you'll recognize, part of Jay Herman, Adam Szabo, and Greg Robinson, and Colleen Hartman, and many others. So we spent an hour talking with Mr. Gore. He was totally enthusiastic and asked questions about everything, anything to do with climate change and composition, and it was a fun time. And so that kind of brings us to the present. Discover launched. It got to L1 a few weeks ago. All signs are good. We can expect, I think, the real images, hopefully in the next month or two. First light. This is a simulated image. And based on a conversation I had with Jay and Sasha this morning, I made sure to say simulated at the top. But this is from Karen Blank from the project team, a really beautiful image taking MODIS and LRO data and downscaling it to the right resolutions of Discover, with the idea of this is probably what we'll see during one of those transits. And I suspect that'll be probably pretty close to what we see with the real thing when that happens in the next few months. So it's been kind of a weird journey. I hope I've held your interest. I never imagined that I would be with NASA. I know that my father was incredibly proud when I went to work with NASA in '88. He unfortunately passed away in the early '90s, and so he couldn't see what I ended up doing and ending up at headquarters, and I think he would have loved that. But I really owe it to him and my mother and brother and all of these weird chance encounters and being nurtured with all of this NASA literature and being fascinated and having grown up around the time of the Apollo program. So it was the right time, the right place, running into Bob Watson on a Pan Am flight from Heathrow. And so here I am, and hopefully I'll be around for a number of years to come. I hope at headquarters. We'll see what the future what lies for me in the future. Either good or bad news. I just signed for another year. I got approval from my Dave Young at Langley and from Jack at headquarters to be Eckman program manager for at least one more year. So you're stuck with me for yet another year. But anyway, thanks for your attention. I've had a lot of fun. Hopefully you've had some interest in listening to the story. And thanks again.
Comments, questions, please.
Speechless.
We ran into Bob Watson on the plane. Was he working at NASA headquarters then?
Yes, he was. If I'm not mistaken, I think he might have been running the Upper Atmosphere Research Program at the time. Oh, okay. Back in that '87 time frame? Okay. Yeah. I don't quite recall the exact. I think he was transiting through Washington because I remember talking again with him and Liz in the terminal. I was waiting for, a United flight to Norfolk, and he and Liz were going somewhere other than Washington. And I remember his passport. It was incredibly thick with tons of extra pages and visa stamps and, Anyway, Mike.
Yeah. Actually, at that time, I think Bob had advanced to the position that Jack Kay is presently in. And the Upper Atmosphere Research Program was being managed by Jim Margatan and me.
Oh, my gosh. Okay. Could very well be. Yeah, this would have been November of '87. And, the fact that Bob was on TV representing NASA on BBC one evening on the news.
Surprised that you had to walk back in the plane to get to his seat. I would have done
that he must have missed an upgrade or something because, I don't know that Pan Am had anything like Economy Plus, but I was certainly in Economy, and he and Liz were farther back. It's possible they may have had an exit row. I'm just guessing because I found them very easily behind me. And Pan Am, I guess all airlines were a little bit more easygoing at the time because I think I probably stood there for 10 or 15 minutes just yakking with them and really appreciated the time to talk with them. Yeah. Charles.
So you wanted to go to Livermore and you were convinced to go to Langley. Did you at any point say, oh, I wish I had gone to Livermore instead?
Oh, gosh. No, not really. And again, nothing negative to connote about Don Wibbles, who I remain very good friends with. As you're probably aware, his program, various people left during the 90s. Joyce Penner went on to Michigan, Doug Kinnison to NCAR, and so the modeling program broke up and I guess became less of a priority for the Department of Energy. So that atmospheric modeling that was so directly relevant to NASA and our field didn't really, I guess it was still quite active with the, Doug Rotman was still very active with the 3D modeling in the late 90s, but no, I never regretted it. I think the only thing, it would have been nice to be near my brother, but we're on different coasts. He's still out in Sebastopol up near in Santa Rosa, California, but we see each other pretty often, so yeah.
Okay, so let's finish one more time.
Thank you.